Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, your ticket to all things college football. Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? Join us as we talk college football, from the national championship to college rivalries to bowl games to the Heisman Trophy to which conference is the best. We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between.
Thanks for tuning in to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jessica Kofi. The 2020 NFL Draft was not too long ago, and when the draft began, at least if you were anything like me, sports fans all over North America rushed to their TV sets, craving to see any live sports action, apart from the WNBA draft that was just a week before. And besides those two live events, it seems like we've been on a hiatus from sports that has lasted forever. But instead of a physical draft in Las Vegas, as we know, the players and their families, as well as the coaches, the team personnel, owners, everybody involved, huddled around their own TV sets with live streams, putting all of us into their homes, and we all watched players find their new pro destinations. And it was a great community moment for sports fans to be able to feel like there is still a community out there that's really missing football. So now that the first virtual NFL draft is come and gone, there are countless college football storylines that have been birthed from it. So in this episode, we're going to break down the top takeaways from this year's NFL draft. And to get started in segment one, of course, it's no surprise here that the most talked about part of the draft was that the SEC dominated once again. As much as some of us, especially fans from outside the SEC, hate that fact, we already know that the SEC is always going to provide the draft with a high quantity of picks to choose from. But what makes them stand out and what gives them all this dominance is that the quality is up there too. And it's very clear that the path to the NFL is the most effective recruiting tool that schools can use. And that is what the SEC's game plan has been in recruiting for the past however many decades now to build the empire that we see today. And it's not a new concept at all. We've seen the SEC routinely clean up in recruiting and constantly have the most players drafted. But right now it feels like they're flexing on the rest of the league extra hard right now. And the 15 picks in the first round, 40 picks over the first three, and 63 total players taken in this year's draft, that empire is only going to be bolstered and grow stronger and realistically just continue to attract more student talent, especially from the South. That's what really sets them apart. From the first pick to the 106th pick, they saw everything taken from quarterbacks to linemen on offense and defense, and it just felt kind of like the conference was force-feeding its players into the league, even though it, again, is completely deserved. And it really is just a lot of fatigue from seeing the SEC do the same thing that we've seen them do again and again. And personally, as somebody who is not a fan of a team from the SEC, it does get a little tiring and a little annoying to constantly be talking about the same conference over and over again. And college football fans around the country are also dealing with that same SEC fatigue, and adding another spoonful, or technically 40, to that isn't the easiest to digest. So it comes off as a little bit obnoxious, the fact that they're able to flex really hard on the rest of us and our teams, but you can't really hate on facts. And the fact is that the SEC accounted for 25% of the players that were selected in not just this draft, but the last two NFL drafts. So the conference set a record with 6 players selected in the top 10, and the love didn't stop there, of course. If you know anything about the SEC, the conference's 40 picks tied the all-time record for the most selections for a conference through the first 4 rounds, which was also set, shockingly, by the SEC back in 2013. And the 14 was also one short of the total for the Big Ten, Pac-12, and Big 12 in that same span. So that doesn't paint the picture for you enough of their dominance. 5 different SEC schools had players picked in the top 10, while no other conference had more than one school represented in that same span in the draft. 13 of the 14 schools in that conference had a player that was taken in the top 3 rounds, and the only one that didn't, which was Ole Miss, probably still should get half credit for Florida wide receiver Van Jefferson, since he was a transfer from the Rebels. And they were just a year removed from having 6 selections themselves, which was the most ever for them in a 7-round draft. So even if you did take away LSU and it took away Georgia and Alabama from the SEC's draft tally from the first 3 rounds, the league would still have more picks than any other at 18. And since numbers don't lie, and these numbers indicate that the SEC not only has the most NFL level talent that's ready to go into the league and are taken near the top, but it also is proof that they are most talented throughout their conference. And that is not an easy thing for a non-SEC fan to admit, but again, numbers don't lie, and it's just backed up by truth. And there was one team that was specifically centered in and zeroed in on the SEC's progress, and that was the Cleveland Browns, who surprisingly took SEC players with each of their first 4 picks. That's just the 3rd time a team has made 4 picks from the same conference within the first 3 rounds in the common draft era since 1988. And the 83 Oilers and 88 Rams are the only other teams to do it, and they did so with what was then the Pac-10. So getting back into this draft, it wasn't until between picks 132 and 141 when the draft finally had 10 consecutive picks without a player from the SEC. And that's just crazy when you think about the magnitude of the draft and just how many players are being picked. And in the grand scope of college football, it's not that many. So for the SEC to take that large of a percentage of it is really something that stands out, and it's notable. And as easy as they're making it look, it shouldn't be taken for granted as something that is easy to do. Of the 255 players that were selected, the 63 from the SEC made it 6 consecutive years that the conference had 50 or more players taken. And in case you're wondering and just couldn't get your fill of SEC stats and knowledge, because, of course, the last time the SEC didn't have the most picks in a draft was back in 2006, when they were actually beat out by the ACC, who had 51. That year, Jay Cutler was the first SEC player taken off of the board, and at number 11 overall by the Denver Broncos. And that should just go to show what the strength of that draft probably looked like, because Jay Cutler is probably, at least in my opinion, not a player that you would want to point to as being taken first out of your conference, at least in hindsight. So that brings us to our first break. But when we come back, you guessed it, we're going to stick with the SEC and break down the schools in the conference that were among the top performers.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC podcast. Now, before the break, we went over the results of the NFL draft on college football and started with the SEC and just how dominant they showed that they were. And in the second segment, we're going to continue on with, you guessed it, more SEC-related topics. But this time, we're going to focus on LSU and how the stars from the Tigers really stood out and shown in this draft, even amongst all of the conference shared dominance. And it's been 3 months since they won the national championship, but LSU is still dominating the football landscape incredibly. The 2019 team broke so many records on the way to their title-winning season, but they also set a new mark in this year's draft after 14 players were picked, and that marked an SEC record. Starting with Heisman Trophy winner quarterback Joe Burrow, of course, who was taken number 1 overall by the Cincinnati Bengals. The Tigers then went on to match Ohio State's mark from 2004. And you could argue in LSU's favor that this squad that we just saw was probably the best college football team of all time. And the amount of players that were taken from this past team in 2019 who heard their names called, albeit not in person on a draft stage, but it definitely does help that case and help prove that, okay, the amount of draft eligible players that aren't returning to the school and were not just declared, but were taken in the draft really points to just how talented and how deeply stocked that team was during the season. Probably even more than we were able to acknowledge while they were playing. But those 15-0 Tigers saw 5 players selected in round 1, falling just one short of the record set by the 2004 Hurricanes of Miami, and they had 2 taken in the second round. Those picks were edge rusher Clavon Chason at number 20, wide receiver Justin Jefferson at number 22, linebacker Patrick Queen at 28, running back Clyde Edwards-Helaire taken at 32 by the Kansas City Chiefs, and that's definitely one area and one player to keep an eye out for, because that combination could definitely be very dangerous on the pro level. Safety Grant Delpit at 44, and cornerback Christian Fulton at 61. That list goes on to include 3 picks in round 3, which were guard Damian Lewis, center Lloyd Cushenberry III, and linebacker Jacob Phillips. 2 more in round 4, offensive tackle Sadiq Charles, and defensive tackle Rashard Lawrence, and 1 in round 6, which was surprisingly a long snapper, Blake Ferguson. Yeah, you heard me correctly, a long snapper. It is so impressive and says so much of your team if even your long snapper is being drafted. And not even in the last round, in round 7 either, in round 6. in round 7, they had tight end Steven Sullivan that was taken, and their long snapper was taken a round before him, and most of the kickers that were drafted. So if that doesn't speak volumes to the type of team that we watched, maybe this will. The only team in college history with more players taken in the draft was the 1984 Texas Longhorns, who had 17 players, but they were taken over 12 rounds. Keep in mind that the draft now is only 7 rounds. So the Tigers' 14 picks also tie the 1975 USC Trojans for the most in the common draft era by a reigning national champion. But in that draft, it's really notable and needs to be pointed out that there were 442 picks and 17 rounds. So, again, to reiterate, in this year's drafts, there were 255 picks overall and 7 rounds. So, not only is this team good, they're efficiently good. And it's even more impressive that they're comparable to schools and programs who were competing under a completely different set of rules and had more leeway to do so. So, if you're looking at the development of college football, that would probably be a great way to really compare the new age versus the old era that we were used to seeing. And things are just handled so much differently now. And that is further proved by the fact that Joe Burrow is the 3rd straight transfer quarterback to win the Heisman Trophy and then be selected number 1 overall in the NFL draft. He's falling behind Kyler Murray and Baker Mayfield in the last 2 seasons, but those transfer quarterbacks weren't the only ones that were taken, and that trend isn't exclusive to just the top pick. If you look to Jalen Hurts, he was also a transfer quarterback, and so was Jacob Eason, and they were taken further down in the draft. And unless we see a less than stellar season from Justin Fields, which that's assuming that there is a season that is still planning on going forward, it would really be unexpected to see that trend not come close to continuing. And he has a really good chance of being the 4th consecutive quarterback to improve his situation that ends up benefiting him with an NFL career. And Burrow was also just the 2nd player in this common draft era to win a national championship, a Heisman Trophy, and then be taken number 1 overall as well in the span of 1 year. The only other player to pull that off that we've seen was Auburn's Cam Newton. And given all of his struggles in the NFL in the last few years that were due to injury, and despite all of that and a tumultuous relationship with his Panthers franchise towards the end of his time there, there's definitely no knock that you can make about Cam Newton's career, and especially when he was at Auburn. And the fact that he was able to translate that talent from the amateur level in college to the pros while blocking out all of the criticism that came around switching positions or not living up to potential. And speaking of another college player that has a lot of potential to live up to, LSU's Clyde Edwards-Helaire might be the best receiving back in this draft. And I touched a little bit on him earlier in the podcast and how his combination with the Kansas City Chiefs is going to be interesting to watch. And that's because the Chiefs are highly productive. And they have a target on their backs, being the reigning Super Bowl champions. And all they did was beef up their roster and increase the size of the target, in my opinion. And Edwards-Helaire is the perfect type of receiving back to draft to help with their situation because he's tremendous in the open field. He forces the 2nd most missed tackles in college football, at least for last season. He had 97. And we know Chiefs quarterback Patrick Mahomes already. And he is definitely fond of his running backs who can catch passes, having thrown 16 touchdowns to running backs in the last 2 seasons and averaging an NFL best almost 8 yards per attempt when targeting running backs over the course of his career. So on both sides, it's coming together like a great fit. And for further comparison, consider how Andy Reid, who is the current coach of the Kansas City Chiefs, used Brian Westbrook back when he was the coach of the Philadelphia Eagles. And between 2002 and 2009, Westbrook caught twice as many touchdown passes as the next best running back with 29. So Andy Reid definitely gets the benefit of the doubt here when it comes to taking Edwards-Helaire and the kind of plan that he might have in mind for him, because we've seen him do it before, and we've seen how successful that he can be at it. And if you add a weapon like that to an offense like the Chiefs, there's almost no telling what the limit of that team will be once we're able to see them on the field, whenever that may be. So it's very clear that we're going to be talking about the 2019 LSU team for a very long time, and we're going to remember just how punishing that this edition of the Tigers were on the field. But more importantly, when we're going to look back on this to remember in the future, simply put, we're probably going to be able to point to just how many future professionals came off of this team that we watched in 2019. So we were already aware that we were watching history in the making, but we might have just watched history continue to make itself even further with even more than we could have expected. And the expectations are high for this group, so it wouldn't be a surprise if there were players who did get drafted and did have solid careers still be, in the end, considered a little bit of a bust or not hitting those expectations that were placed on them now. And that's not going to be an indication of how well they adjusted to the league or how talented they actually are. That's just an indication of how much they've already proven and how high they've already reached. So we could see legends coming out of this draft from this LSU team. We've already seen them make college history and solidify themselves as college legends, especially Joe Burrow. But as we continue to see them grow over the course of their careers and settle into their full potentials, or at least see the extent of the full potentials that they can reach, we'll start to see what, if any, genuine Hall of Fame careers come out of this group. And that brings us to our next break. But when we come back, if you thought the SEC conversation was over, it isn't just yet. And we're going to take a look at yet another school that was able to show the conference dominance as well.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
We're back with the College Football Podcast. And in the first two segments, we talked about the SEC and how they were all over this draft. It was all SEC all the time. And in the second segment, we took a little bit of a closer look at one of the teams that stood out the most, and that was the LSU Tigers. Now, for this segment, we're going to continue on with the SEC, no surprise there. But we're going to take a look at another team that did well, but is usually expected to be the top producer out of the conference. And that school was Alabama. And although Alabama took a little bit of a step back, they still had their influence in their hands all over this draft, even further than you would expect them to. And that it doesn't just go for the University of Alabama and Nick Saban's squad that we are so used to seeing and is always in the front of the spotlight, but that just goes for the state as a whole as well. And just to recap a little bit for Alabama, their season ended in a Citrus Bowl appearance, which for them would probably be considered a disappointment. For the first time, they didn't make the college football playoff since its inception in 2014. But that still didn't stop Bama from feeding the NFL plenty of talent. And Nick Saban's team had 9 players drafted, and while that's still a really good showing, it did snap the streak of having at least 10 players selected in each of the last 3 drafts for Alabama. There were 4 Crimson Tide offensive players selected on the first night, and on day 2, Bama saw 5 defensive players drafted alone. And they included 3 second-round selections, one in a safety Xavier McKinney, who went 36th overall to the New York Giants, cornerback Trayvon Diggs, who went 51st to the Dallas Cowboys, and is also the younger brother of Stephon Diggs. So it's going to be interesting to see that brother pairing in the league. And defensive end Raekwon Davis, who went 56th to the Miami Dolphins. And then there were linebackers Terrell Lewis and Anthony Jennings, who were taken in the 3rd round by the LA Rams with the 84th overall pick, and by the New England Patriots with the 87th overall picks, respectively. And Bill Belichick and the Patriots kind of stuck their necks out to take linebacker Jennings. And that became the 10th player that Belichick has drafted from under Saban's head coaching lineage while in college. And that pick also set the record for the most selections by one NFL coach of players who served under one coach in college in the Common Draft era. So we started to see Alabama's hands all over this draft, to say the least. We already know that the big superstar coming out of their program was Tua Tagovailoa, who was their top pick, taken number 5 overall to the Miami Dolphins. And Alabama, on top of that, also saw 4 players selected in the top 15, which was tied for the most in the Common Draft era. Besides Tagovailoa at number 5, offensive tackle Jedrick Willis Jr. was also taken at number 10, which even may have been considered a little bit of a slide for him, as he was seen as probably the best tackle overall in the draft, and there were a handful that were taken in front of him. At number 10, wide receiver Henry Ruggs III was taken as the first wide receiver off the board, and at number 12, right behind him almost, was wide receiver Jerry Jeudy, his counterpart during college. And in essence, when you look at all of the players that were taken between Alabama and LSU's rosters, you could make an entirely full 22-man lineup of your own just from their draft picks, which is incredible. fact that you were able to find every single position, even, like was mentioned earlier, a long snapper, which is still blowing my mind if you couldn't tell, and I am probably not alone in that thought. But the deep ties extend even further than that. There were 15 NFL teams that added a player with an Alabama root of some type, with the Eagles drafting up to 4, the Dolphins adding 3 more, and the Bears taking 2 themselves. The players with Alabama football roots entering through this draft start with the players that we already know from the Alabama roster, but also include other players that you may have heard of, like defensive tackle Derek Brown, who played for Auburn and was taken by the Panthers in the top 10, or cornerback Noah Abinohene from Hewitt-Trussville High School in Alabama, and also took the Auburn route before being drafted by the Dolphins. Defensive end Marlon Davison, who came from Greenville High School and Auburn in Alabama and was taken by the Falcons. There's running back LaMichael Perrine, who is from Alabama and went to Theodore High School, even though he played in Florida, and was taken by the New York Jets. There's guard Logan Stenberg from James Clemens High School in Madison, Alabama, who is now going to the Detroit Lions. Offensive tackle Jack Driscoll from Auburn, who was one that was picked by the Philadelphia Eagles. Safety Dale Thomas from Lee High School in Montgomery and played at Auburn as well, is now going to the Jacksonville Jaguars. Wide receiver Darnell Mooney from Gadsden City High School is headed to Chicago to play for the Bears. Wide receiver Quest Watkins from Athens High School is headed to the Eagles. Offensive tackle Prince Tega Wanogo from Edgewood Academy in Elmore and also Auburn is also going to take the Eagles by storm. And offensive tackle Latavius Simmons from Selma High School was drafted by the Chicago Bears. And for what it's worth, there is one NFL team that sticks out the most as being fond of players from an Alabama championship game, and maybe more specifically the 2018 National Championship game. And that team is the Las Vegas Raiders, who last year selected 3 Clemson players after they won the national title, and also added Alabama's Josh Jacobs on top of that roster to help bolster the offensive side of the ball for them. And this year they kind of stuck to the same game plan, it seems like, because they added 3 more players from that same championship title game in 2018, and they took Henry Ruggs, Tanner Muse, and John Simpson off of that Alabama squad. So it is hard to hate on that strategy completely, because those were 2 good teams that competed in that game, Alabama and Clemson. And so far, the first half of that experiment from last year seems to be working a little bit in their favor for so far. So maybe they're trying to test whether being good in college helps you be good in the pros. I don't know. That's just a guess from the outside looking in to see maybe what the Raiders may be thinking about. But we'll definitely find out what their strategy is whenever the next NFL season is able to kick off. And as for Alabama, all of this just goes to prove that even in a down year, the Crimson Tide are still really, really good. And that is undeniable, especially when you take a look at how they did comparing to a lot of other teams in the SEC. As we touched on earlier, they may have come behind LSU a little bit, and LSU is definitely the team to beat now. So they may be taking a little bit of shine away from Alabama. But Bama, Crimson Tide, and even the state of Alabama have all proven that they cannot be removed from the scene, and the contributions that they're making, not just to college football, but to the NFL and the stock of NFL talent that we've seen grow over the past decade at least, is a testament to their program, to Nick Saban, and to the SEC as a whole, as annoying as it may be to acknowledge how dominant they are or how good they are. It's not something that you, especially as a fan from outside of the SEC, ever want to get used to saying or even admit on a regular basis. But through the first half of this podcast, we've been able to establish their dominance, not just presently, but over comparable teams of the past, and even compared to their very own team in the past. And it just goes to show how big of an impact and how important that conference has become, and schools like Alabama have become, to the progress and the platform of the SEC. And that brings us to our next break. But when we come back, we're finally going to step outside of the Southeastern Conference and take a look at how the draft affected everybody else.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's gsmcpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
We're back with the College Football Podcast, and before the break, in the first 3 segments, we touched on the SEC, their very well-known dominance, and the fact that it is very annoying to continue to talk about them, but they've done nothing to move themselves out of the spotlight, and they keep giving us reasons to talk about them, and they are just frankly quite impressive. But enough about the SEC. In this segment, we're going to stick to non-SEC news and updates that came out of the NFL draft. And for the other Power 5 conferences, the Big Ten had 48 selections, which was the second most out of any conference, behind, you already know. And the Pac-12 came in third with 32 picks. The ACC had 27 players drafted, and that goes down as one of their least fruitful years in some time now. But through the first 3 rounds, ACC schools produced 8 picks, and that was their fewest since 2003. So, for the 9th straight year, the Big 12 tied for or had outright the fewest picks from any Power 5 conference. Now, to be fair, they do only have 10 schools, which is the fewest number of schools out of any of the Power 5 conferences as well. But after having 26 players taken in last year's draft, including the number 1 overall pick in Kyler Murray to the Arizona Cardinals, the conference only posted 21 for this year. And that was one below their average number of draft picks since 2012. And 3 schools were left out of the drafts entirely. So it's not the greatest showing by the other 4 Power 5 conferences, especially when you compare them to the constantly dominant SEC. And there are certain schools that we can look at and understand that they didn't have the greatest 2019 season. Say, like the Florida State Seminoles, we know how the season went for them. But it still feels weird to say a school like Florida State just had 1 player drafted, while a school like Florida International had 2. That is really out of the ordinary, and that is not the greatest showing for that Power 5, especially the Big 12 and the ACC. But on the plus side, the great receiver class that had been so highly anticipated really did live up to its billing, fortunately. 8 receivers flew off the board throughout the first 35 picks, and that was the highest total in this draft era. 26 were drafted through 5 rounds, and a total of 36 were drafted overall, tying the record that was set back in 2003 for the most in a 7-round draft. So this was a perfect mixture of talent and the annual need of playmaking receivers in this highly pass-happy league that the NFL has become. And no team was more focused on receivers than, you guessed it, the Raiders, who we mentioned last segment, and became the first team in 38 years to draft 3 receivers in the first 3 rounds of the same draft. It's only happened twice before, with the 1982 Saints and all the way back to 1967 with the Minnesota Vikings. So we know that they took Henry Ruggs III, the fastest receiver in the draft. They took Kentucky's Lynn Bowden, who was an all-around playmaker, and South Carolina's Brian Edwards can be a really strong presence on the outside, perhaps lined up in the slot, but would probably need a little more development and a little more time on a roster to develop his skills and, of course, develop chemistry with his team and between himself and quarterback Derek Carr. So now they're kind of setting it up that if Derek Carr ultimately falters and fails under Coach John Gruden, it's not going to be because of their lack of weapons, which has been a problem for them in the last few years. So they really took advantage of this year's depth at wide receiver and just the draft's overall depth in general. So hopefully they're able to turn those assets into playable pieces on the field. And you could try to kind of say the same is true for the Denver Broncos, who are now under second-year quarterback Drew Lock. And in the same kind of ways, they might also be one of the top winners of this draft, the Denver Broncos. They not only have Cortland Sutton still on their roster, but now they've added, along with that veteran receiving presence, they now have Jerry Jeudy, who they took with their round 1 pick, and KJ Hamler, who they took in the second. Not to mention they're reuniting Locke with his former tight end at Missouri, Albert Okwuegbunam, who they picked in the 4th round. And there still remains a lot to be seen from the Denver Broncos offense before any decision either way is able to be decided. But the one piece that they didn't really improve through this draft, the offensive line, is probably going to be the last piece of the puzzle that we'll see that needs to be solved for the Broncos. But for now, hopefully they and the Raiders are able to manage their young quarterbacks alongside their very young and now a lot deeper wide receiving core. As for the top 3 players selected in the draft, who were Joe Burrow, as we know, Chase Young, who went number 2 to the Redskins, and Jeff Okudah, who went to the Detroit Lions. Believe it or not, they were all once teammates at Ohio State back in 2017. And while we're very aware that Burrow transferred and had a lot of success elsewhere, Urban Meyer proved that he really knew how to pick them while he was still head coaching at Ohio State. And that really shouldn't come as a shock or a huge surprise to anybody who's been keeping track of college football, and especially Big Ten college football, over the past 20 or so years. But that is a standout stat in its own. The fact that the first 3 players chosen were all at one point teammates is kind of a tribute to the Ohio State program. I don't know. You can declare with that what you want. Take a look at that however you want to. But that is an impressive feat that we barely ever get to see, if ever. And speaking of that draft luck, Oklahoma became the first school to have quarterbacks taken in the first 2 rounds 3 years in a row, with this year's selection of Jalen Hurts by the Eagles at number 53 overall. The 2 that came before him, of course, were the aforementioned Baker Mayfield and Kyler Murray, who each went number 1 in 2018 and 2019, and we are well aware of them already. So Oklahoma's kind of placing themselves up there with Ohio State in terms of player talent development in history books. But when it comes to the quarterback factory, which I think is a very interesting term, that apparently applies to neither school, but for some reason is applying to the Philadelphia Eagles, according to their GM, Howie Roseman. And generally speaking, we know that NFL teams expect a lot of early contribution from their first and second round picks within the first 2 seasons or so. But since the quarterback, which they are now building a factory around, apparently, is so important of a position. And the fact that the Eagles are so frequently in a position of having an injured starter and all of the implications that come with that and the pressure to find a suitable backup, and a lot of times on a last-minute basis, it's really a mystery why more teams don't draft quarterbacks more often and basically just assign his development to one assistant coach or quarterback coach that's able to just focus on developing that quarterback prospect into what the team needs. And even if whatever player that happens to be never ends up helping win a game, that quarterback can still really turn into a trade asset and help bring even more back to your team if you do have enough suitable quarterbacks but need help, say, at another position. So with all of that being said, it's a little confusing why Philadelphia would be the team to take Hurts at that place that they did if the expectation is that he's not going to be playing quarterback for the next few years under starter Carson Wentz unless Wentz gets injured again. And that's a likely possibility given the entire professional history we've seen of Carson Wentz. There are very few years, if not until last year, that he was able to complete a season and actually play in the postseason. So it's a little bit of a question mark there as to why they wouldn't be more serious about Jalen Hurts at this point. But they do get the benefit of the doubt for a little while because there could be an alternate offensive plan in mind for Jalen Hurts. But in my opinion, I just hope that doesn't include trying to move him to any other positions, because that's a move you see teams try to use with quarterbacks and more specifically black quarterbacks a lot of the time. And Jalen Hurts has done way more than enough in his college career to prove that he is a viable quarterback and deserves to be given a chance at that position. So if that's why Philly took him, kudos to them. He will probably have a great impact on their team, but hopefully that doesn't take anything away from him being able to play the quarterback position at a professional level. And lastly, in non-SEC draft news, one of the craziest NFL streaks is over. Since the common draft era started in 1967, at least one USC defensive player has been drafted in every single year. There were some close calls, but they always got one in. Like in 1991, when the first defender was taken in the 9th round, which the draft doesn't even have 9 rounds anymore. So that just goes to show just how closely they got that one in. From Junior Seau to Troy Polamalu to Willie McGinnis, even Al Cowlings. Those are all huge defensive names, not just at the college level, but definitely Hall of Fame level in the NFL. And those are just a few of the names of players that you could call out that have helped keep this USC streak going until 2020. Of course, this is the year where everything that we've known is seemingly coming to an end, and the Trojans' best hopes were for defensive end Christian Rector and outside linebacker John Houston Jr. to be picked up by a team, and neither one was considered a top lock to get into the draft, and sadly the 7th round went by without either one of them hearing his name called. And just in general, that is an unfortunate and really sad situation to see for any player, but it makes it even worse for USC because they really had a life draft with only 2 players overall picked, and that's been the fewest for them since 2002. To add insult to injury a little bit, they were also passed for the most first-round picks in history by, who else? Ohio State, the kingpins of the Big Ten, who had 2 picks on the first day of the draft, giving them 83 all-time. And that's one more than USC, so they were just barely edged out. And for USC, that is not the greatest sign. That's not what you hoped to see because of how many rough years the program has been through within the last decade. And it looks like the rough times just got a little bit rougher for Southern California. But hopefully once they're able to hit the field, they can start turning that luck around and And maybe they'll be lucky enough to not have to face this type of disappointment again. That brings us to yet another break, but when we come back, we're going to touch on the undrafted free agents and which one of them were the biggest signings to the NFL.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
We're back with the College Football Podcast, and before the break, we touched on the SEC conference and the dominance they held over the 2020 NFL virtual draft. And we also touched on all of the news and updates that affected college football that came from the other Power 5 conferences. And now in this segment, we're going to touch on all of the players that were standouts but ended up going undrafted, and the ones that ended up being signed to new professional situations. So the first one we're going to touch on was Khalil Tate, and the former Arizona signal caller is heading to Philly to pad the quarterback position even further, and they've previously selected former Alabama and Oklahoma quarterback Jalen Hurts, which we talked about in the last segment. So you would think that they'd be set at the position, but in the most predictable NFL move ever, which I just touched on a little bit, they've signed him not as a quarterback, but as a wide receiver. And for a team that's trying to brand themselves as the quarterback factory, it's a little bit of a weird move. Not to mention that it's a move that's been heavily criticized by critics, fans, players themselves, over years and years, especially as we've seen more black quarterbacks not just come into the position, but excel at the position. Lamar Jackson and Deshaun Watson don't even need to be brought up as an example because they are still players who are heavily playing against that kind of criticism. So he's not even the first quarterback to wide receiver conversion that the Eagles themselves have made, let alone the NFL has made. And the Eagles have had Greg Ward, who played a big role for them last season, but was the starting quarterback at Houston. They've also had Braxton Miller and David Watford on their rosters in recent seasons, and neither one of those have panned out. Braxton Miller is one player coming out of Ohio State that was a little bit iffy and probably wasn't the most NFL ready at the time, but he was one player that was easily shifted out of his original quarterback position and never really was given a true chance in the NFL to show what he could do in the pocket, or even prove that he could handle playing in the pocket as a starter, even as a backup. So that's really disappointing on the Eagles' part in the past, and even more disappointing now that they're repeating the same, in my opinion, mistake. And Tate really did have some success at QB when he was playing at Arizona, and he definitely showed how athletic he is. So it's at least a little bit intriguing to me that the Eagles are willing to convert him to a receiver so fast and so easily. And not to mention that they already have a very suddenly crowded receiver core in Philly, and they're trying to add him to that. So it looks like they probably have more of a need to add depth behind the quarterback position and not necessarily the wide receiver position, because they managed to take care of that a lot through the draft and through signings. But it still remains to be seen just how Khalil Tate is going to be used on their team. And I, for one, am hopefully looking forward to see him get a chance to play his original position. But landing on an NFL team is nothing to take for granted, so it's very good to see that he ended up being signed and his talent isn't just going to go to waste by not being on a football roster somewhere. And that brings us to the second on the list, Brian Lewerke, who was added to the Patriots depth chart earlier this week. And the Michigan State starter played for 3 years and threw over 3,000 yards and 17 touchdowns against 13 interceptions as a rookie, and totaled over 8,000 passing yards over his entire college career over the span of 3 years. So he's bringing plenty of experience with him in a big-time program, which is a big deal, and that's always an asset. But he was also very known to have his ups and downs during his time as a Spartan, and that is what probably pushed him out of a draftable position. But he still showed his best during some years, such as his sophomore season, when he threw 20 touchdowns compared to just 7 interceptions for a team that finished 10-3. So turnovers were a problem for him over the next 2 years. He had 24 total interceptions versus just 25 touchdowns over a span of 24 games, and that is probably why teams were very hesitant on him. But if there is any team in the league that can take an underdeveloped prospect and turn them into an NFL starter, it is definitely Bill Belichick and the New England Patriots. So if Brian Lewerke was going to get any chance really to prosper in the league, he's in the best position to do so. So we're just going to have to wait and see where his career goes from there. Next up is Ladarius Mack. And his name should sound a little bit familiar because his older brother is none other than Khalil Mack, who is already on the Chicago Bears roster. So the Bears just doubled down on the family by agreeing to a deal with Ladarius, and it's really great to see that. Just like his brother, he came out of Buffalo, where he appeared in 27 games. He racked up 10 sacks and had 4 forced fumbles for the Bulls, and he earned a second-team All-MAC honor after putting up 8 sacks, 3 forced fumbles, and 12 tackles for loss last year alone. But unlike his superstar brother, who really was a top prospect all the way through, Ladarius has a much harder road to making an NFL roster, and is going to have to prove himself, especially with such a high bar set by your older sibling, that he isn't just coming off of being Khalil Mack's brother, and that he actually has the talent himself to make it on the pro level. But with all that being said, how cool would it be, honestly, to see the 2 Mack brothers pass rushing at the same time? So hopefully we'll get that reality. Next is Thaddeus Moss, who has been added to Washington's roster, and they really did need another pass catcher to help out Dwayne Haskins. And now that LSU tight end Thaddeus Moss is planning to sign with the team, on top of being the son of Randy Moss, of course, obviously, Hall of Famer, often considered the best, if not one of the best, wide receivers of all time in the NFL, Thaddeus proved that he could be a breakout star himself. At LSU in 2019, he really came out of his shell after missing the 2017 season after transferring from North Carolina State, and in the 2018 campaign when he was a medical redshirt due to a foot injury. So the now 21-year-old helped the undefeated Tigers reach a 15-win season. He caught 47 passes for 570 yards and 4 touchdowns. And he shined in the national title game versus Clemson with 5 catches and 2 scores. So he comes in at 6'3", 250 pounds, which is exactly what NFL teams love to see, especially in a tight end. And he declared for the draft soon after. And now he's on his way to finding success in the same league that his father did on the way to being inducted into the Hall of Fame as a wide receiver. And having a father that dominated the league that you're trying to enter for a decade and a half are some big shoes to fill, but Thaddeus has made it clear that he is not aiming to repeat his father's footsteps, and he wants to forge his own path. So hopefully we'll be able to see him accomplish that in Washington. Next on the list is Jamar Chase, who was also signed by the New England Patriots, who, if you couldn't tell, are in a little bit of a quarterback hole and are looking for their next replacement. And they did pass on taking any passers in the draft, but they inked Louisiana Tech's Jamar Smith after the fact. And he was a 3-year starter in college, throwing for almost 3,000 yards, 18 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, and completed 64% of his passes during his senior year last year. Plus, he had a 59% completion rate, 51 touchdowns, and 21 interceptions throughout his overall career. So, he might not have the most impressive numbers across the board, but his performance in 2019 was enough for him to win the Conference USA Offensive Player of the Year, and now, obviously, he's done enough to at least somewhat impress Belichick. So he's going to become the third QB behind the presumed starter right now, who is Jarrett Stidham, and the veteran backup, who is Brian Hoyer. But he's going to have a lot of competition on his hands, and you never know, we might see more development than we think, and he could slip right into that starting spot. And the last undrafted free agent we're going to discuss is Rodrigo Blankenship. And this is a really fun one for me, especially if Adam Vinatieri decided to retire from the Indianapolis Colts, because now they're prepared with the ultimate backup plan when they agreed to sign Georgia's Rodrigo Blankenship. And I am personally really surprised that he managed to slip out of the draft, especially once kickers and even long snappers, again, my mind is bewildered, were being taken in the 6th and 7th rounds. And that's because Blankenship is one of the best kickers in Georgia history, and probably one of the greatest to ever do it in the SEC. The fact that he wasn't taken at all in the draft blows my mind. But he has scored at least 120 points in each of the past 3 seasons and made every single one of his extra point attempts in his career, all 200, on his way to connecting on 82.5% of his field goal attempts in college. And his record and his resume really speaks for itself. And not only is he a Lou Groza Award winner, but he has also solidified himself as a Georgia legend, especially after he became a fan favorite for hitting the game-winning field goal at Kentucky in 2016, and that kind of also put him on the national stage. But he went on to have a distinguished career, and the Hot Rod, as he's called, will have to compete with Chase McLaughlin to win the starting job for the Colts. But on the plus side for him, he's already landed a $20,000 signing bonus from Indianapolis. So I'd say he's off to a solid start, and this is probably not the last that we've heard of Rodrigo Blankenship. And that brings us to our last break. But when we come back, in the last segment, we're going to touch on a few of the new NCAA rule changes.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. Now, earlier in the episode, we touched on all of the takeaways from the NFL virtual drafts and how the SEC and non-SEC conferences alike also affected college football and the undrafted college players that ended up being signed by NFL teams. And in this last segment, we're going to look at the new NCAA rule changes that were passed within this past week and how they're expected to have an impact on college football, both off the field and once the game returns to action. So essentially, a working group was put together to kind of evaluate the potential ways that they could modernize the NCAA's rules for athletes to make money from their names, images, and likenesses. And they presented their recommendations to the Board of Governors during their annual April meeting. This has been a hot button issue for years now, but especially picked up steam within the last few months since the ending of 2019, when states began to implement their own rules governing names, images, and likenesses, and the ability to let students make money from them. So, given all of that history, the recommendations they made now included significant changes to the current restrictions, while also leaving room for the NCAA and schools to regulate the types of deals that athletes might be allowed to sign in the future, and the money value that's going to come out of these individual contracts. So the top governing body of the NCAA said that they do support a proposal to allow college athletes to sign endorsement deals and receive payment from their work, but the exception is that schools that they attend are not allowed to be involved in any of these payments. So the proposed changes are opening the door for athletes to sign these deals with a wide variety of third-party companies. It will also make it possible for these student athletes to monetize their social media channels or profit from writing a book or making a music album, streaming songs, hosting a sports camp, or starting a business, or any other potential opportunity that is now so accessible to college students. And frankly, the NCAA rules haven't been keeping up with these societal changes over the years. And that's where a lot of the friction between student athletes and the big governing body have come from. So athletes would now be allowed to mention their status as a college student and the school that they attend when they're advertising themselves. But these changes don't allow schools to pay the athletes directly or to provide any assistance to athletes in setting up these endorsements. They would not be allowed to use any school-branded marks in their advertisements or wear any clothing with school logos on it, even though they are allowed to brand themselves as students of their school. But the NCAA would also consider regulations that keep athletes from promoting products that don't line up with their values. So stuff like gambling sites, banned substances, anything that the NCAA wouldn't want to promote as being student-friendly, essentially. And individual schools would also be allowed to make a list of products that they don't want, that don't match their values, and say that athletes aren't allowed to endorse them. So it definitely feels like a compromise point has been added to this conversation, but there also seems like there'd be a way for individual schools or the NCAA at any point, if they wanted to kind of exploit those rules. So hopefully that won't happen, or there will be more guidelines put in place to keep the schools and the governing board from also being able to violate these rules. But that remains to be seen for right now. Getting back to the athletes, they'd also be allowed to hire agents or other professionals, like an accountant, for example, to help them further their business opportunities. But the specifics about how they can go about hiring these type of advisors and what the advisors themselves would be allowed to do are still being determined. So there is a good chance that the marketing aspect of this becomes the new arms race in college football and across college sports in general. The way that we've seen up until this point facility upgrades being held to that level of importance. So what we've seen teams recently move towards, even outside of the name, image, and likeness ruling, before all this started to go down, is that they're offering branding and marketing for their student athletes, whether it's utilizing the marketing and creative staff that they already have on campus or bringing in outside agencies like one called Influencer to help educate their student athletes. So given all of this, they suggested that they could implement guardrails that would include no school or conference involvement, no use of the name, image, and likeness for recruiting for schools or for boosters when it comes to endorsement deals for their student athletes. But how the NCAA would police that, or how anything would police the NCAA in return, is still heavily up for debate. But since recruiting is always at least a year ahead, if this was enacted for the next school year, coaches would start to use this recruiting tool as soon as possible. So we would start to see this become an effect a lot earlier than 2021. And they're already recruiting for 2021 and beyond into the 2022 and 23 classes. So the discussion is basically starting, if not already, in the very near future. And while coaches are still very unclear on how this is going to impact recruiting, there is at least one SEC assistant who mentioned that it could end up helping more student athletes stay closer to home for college. Because say a player develops a name and a brand for himself during his high school career or at any point for any reason, it makes more sense in this day and age to think that that player with this following would stay closer to his hometown where he already is known and has a presence than go, say, somewhere across the country and try to rebuild and reestablish himself there. So not only could it have an effect for the students who are already in college, it could change the way we look at the students who are coming into college and recruitment. And the face and patterns of recruitment could change from how we know them today. But most importantly, the NCAA wants to ensure that this isn't just disguised as a pay-for-play, and so schools and conferences don't try to get involved. And in its initial report, they asked for various divisional governing bodies to come up with their own guardrails by October 31st of this year and voted on no later than January 31st of next year. So there's no guarantee that the recommendations that have been put out there and that were just discussed in this segment will remain the same, or that they'll even vote to approve whatever is proposed between now and October. But if the NCAA does vote to accept the new rules, they are scheduled to go into effect no later than the start of the 2021-22 season and academic year. So as for the lawmakers who have been involved in all of the NCAA's decision-making and changes to the way things are operated, they generally look at this announcement as a positive step, but they are very vocal about the details that are still left to be figured out and whether things will actually be followed through when it comes time to put these proposed changes into action. And sadly, one last note, although it wasn't directly addressed, there was some speculation beforehand that this could play a hand into NCAA football, the video game making a comeback, but it's looking like a return for franchises such as NCAA football is unworkable at this point in college football and in college sports in general because there is no college level unionization. And for that to become a reality, that is a whole separate battle. So for now, it looks like we might get most of what's been fought for college athletes. But for fans, NCAA football is not going to make a return anytime soon. And for me personally, that's one of the biggest disappointments that have come out of this announcement. But all the benefits that go to the players, this is definitely a good situation. Thanks for listening to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us. Also, please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network, from football to basketball, baseball to MMA. MMA, and even soccer. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast.